Hey, very good morning, Brumley Baptist Church. It is February the 13th, and we are in Daniel chapter 6, verses 10 through 24. This is session 11, and we continue to play the hits in the book of Daniel. Today, we will look at the lion's den story, and obviously one that is very familiar to you. God can be trusted. The Bible is right about everything. Those are two facts that Christians should live by. God can be trusted, and his word is right about everything. Money, contentment, leadership, basically anything that we want to talk about in God's entire creation are things that we can trust God for. And we should trust God for. Like that should be a normal occurrence for us to trust God with who we are and what we've done and the world around us and all of those sort of things. Daniel is a man who definitely does that. And in this passage in chapter 6, again, you know this story, so we're not going to cover a lot of brand new ground or break, new ground for you today as far as, things that I imagine you've never heard before. But what you will note is that Daniel exhibits this level of trust. Daniel had been taken into exile with the rest of the Jews by the Babylonians around 605 BC. They've been there for 70 years at this point. The Medes and the Persians came in, took over Babylon. Daniel was probably in his 80s about this point. Darius, the king of the Medes and the Persians, gave Daniel an important job, to interpret dreams, to be around the king, that sort of thing. Well, people don't like anyone in authority, and so Daniel's enemies come and try to get rid of him. And they set up a scenario where Daniel does not keep the order of the king, and that leads directly to him being thrown into the lion's den. Even when he doesn't do anything wrong and is being punished, he remains faithful. He doesn't back up from who he knows God to be and what he knows God will do. And to me, that's probably the most important part of this story. So let's look at that today. 3 movements. The trap is set. When Daniel learned the document had been signed, he went into his house. The windows in his upstairs room opened toward Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he got down on his knees, prayed, and gave thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel, petitioning and imploring his God. So they approached the king and asked about his edict. Didn't you sign an edict that for 30 days any person who petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den? And the king answered, as a law of the Medes and the Persians, the order stands and is irrevocable. Then they replied to the king, Daniel, one of the Judean exiles, has ignored you, the king, and the edict you signed, for he prays 3 times a day. As soon as the king heard this, he was very displeased. He set his mind on rescuing Daniel and made every effort until sundown to deliver him. In Daniel chapter 1, verse 8, Daniel purposes in his heart to not defile himself with the king's food. And God honors that. So Daniel has lived through this kind of thing before. This time the king had said that no one was allowed to pray. That if you had a petition, a request, if you had anything going on, you brought it to the king and no one else. You didn't take it to God, Jehovah. You didn't take it to any other god. Well, Daniel couldn't abide by that. He was in the habit, is not probably the best word, but that would cover it. He was in the practice of 3 times a day bowing and praying to Jehovah God. And he wasn't going to stop that just because some king had said he couldn't. And so he continued doing that. Well, the people that were setting him up knew he would continue doing that. They knew what kind of character he had. And so this was a trap. They just set him up in a trap. And now the king is in a corner. Notice in verse 13 and 14, he's very displeased. He has to back up his law. But in verse 14, he doesn't want to. He wants to save Daniel. He wants to rescue Daniel. This is not an occasion that he wants Daniel to be punished, but here he is. He signed this law. How can he get out of it? Well, the door gets shut on it and on Daniel. Then these men went together to the king and said to him, you know, your majesty, that it is a law of the Medes and the Persians that no edict or ordinance the king establishes can be changed. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. And the king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you continually serve, rescue you. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing in regard to Daniel could be changed. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and he could not sleep. He knows how this is going to end, or at least how he thinks it's going to end. He thinks the lions are going to do what lions do, and they're going to devour Daniel. But again, there's nothing he can do about it. The Medes and the Persians have set up this law, and there's nothing he can do to change it because he's part of that royalty or that royal lineage. He's in a corner. The door is closed on him as well, and there's really nothing he can do to get himself out or to get Daniel out. But he does give a promise in verse 16. May the God whom you continually serve rescue you. Maybe God will help you. May that God help you. And then he goes and he fasts and he prays. So Daniel's the one who is being persecuted, but the king who's actually doing the persecution in a weird way spends the night fasting and praying for him. He couldn't sleep. He was troubled by this, and he should have been. He knows that what he's done is wrong. And he realizes, I think, that he's been set up, and he realizes that Daniel has been set up. But at this point, there's just nothing he can do to change it. The way the facts have come into focus here, there's nothing he can do to get around it or to get out of this. And so it's one of those situations when it just is what it is. The door is shut. Daniel is thrown into a den of lions. The lion's den is exactly what it implies. Group of hungry lions, a person is thrown in. Well, that person doesn't come out. The lions do what predators do, except in this case, they do not. How does that happen? Well, God happens. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he reached the den, he cried out in anguish to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you continually serve, been able to rescue you from the lions? Then Daniel spoke with the king, may the king live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they haven't harmed me. For I was found innocent before him, and also before you, your majesty, I have not done harm. The king was overjoyed and gave orders to take Daniel out of the den. When he was brought up from the den, he was found to be unharmed, for he trusted his God. The king then gave the command, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and thrown into the lion's den. They, their children, and their wives. They had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. What they had planned as Daniel's demise became their own demise when they maliciously came against the servant of God. The king is struggling with this. It's very evident from verses 19 and 20. He hurries. He cries out in anguish. He is begging and pleading all through the night, fasting all through the night. He wants Daniel to be okay. He does not want this to end like he assumes it will end because he knows who lions are. But I want you to notice something twice in this passage. Here it's again in verse 20, but it's also mentioned earlier. Daniel, has your God whom you continually serve. I think that's the trick. That's the key. Do we continually serve our God? Without fail, the best we can. Are we faithful to God in every aspect of who we are? That's what we've always got to strive for. That's what we've always got to try to do. To be faithful. We know God will always be faithful to us. Are we faithful to him? And the story gets turned around in the end. What can we learn? We got to worship God alone, no matter who tries to limit us from doing that. No matter what circumstances happen, what edicts come, what laws are in place, no matter what happens around us, will we believe God even when it gets difficult? Even when it costs us everything? Will we believe and trust in God? We can turn to him when we're persecuted. We can turn to him when others are persecuted, just as the king did, fasting and praying and seeking, just as Daniel did in the lion's den. I'm sure that he communed and prayed and talked with God while he was there, because we know that ultimately God vindicates faithful believers. Ultimately, God is honored when believers are faithful. Guys, that's our only call, is to be faithful and allow God to vindicate us when we are faithful. It's a true story, and it can happen every single time when we will be faithful to God. That's our job, to believe him. What did I start with? His word is right, and God is holy and powerful, and we should worship him. God is right. His word is right. Next week, Daniel chapter 7, the future scene. Daniel's going to see this incredible vision, and he's going to give insight to what this vision is in the king's dream and what it means for their future and for ours. Hope you can join me next Sunday morning as we dive into Daniel chapter 7 together. Have a good and godly day. We would love to see you at Brumley Baptist Church, 10 a.m. as we gather together on Sunday mornings, or 6 p.m. as we gather together in person on Wednesday nights. Love to have you join us there sometime. You can go to brumleybaptistchurch.com, find out information about our church family. Love to see you sometime. Have a good and godly day, and until I see you again, go serve your King.